So there I was in northern Japan, just relaxing and enjoying the nice weather, when I saw this poster for the Yonezawa Uesugi Festival. It says, "Fantasy and excitement, an Uesugi picture scroll revived in the modern era. The Battle of Kawanakajima, said to be the greatest mortal combat in the history of the Sengoku Jidai. The fierce battle between Kenshin and Shingen comes back to life here and now." So the Sengoku Jidai was the famous Warring States period of feudal Japan, known for its battles between samurai lords, shinobi. Sengoku Jidai means Age of Civil War, and emaki, or picture scroll, in this context, means historical pageant and spectacle, or, in other words, a reenactment. So this was going to be a Japanese Civil War reenactment. And, as if that wasn't enough, the Fourth Battle of Kawanakajima is genuinely one of the most dramatic and tactical battles of the period. Now, Yonezawa is a fairly small town nestled in the northern mountains, so I figured the reenactment would be pretty small, but local festivals are always a good time, and there would be samurai. So, of course, I had to go. A samurai lord waits for dawn on the plains of Kawanakajima. Up on the mountain, he can see their enemy's camp, campfires lit, over 13,000 men strong. But he is relaxed. He has instructed a portion of his army to sneak towards the enemy's mountain camp during the night. They will strike at dawn, a surprise attack, driving the enemy's forces down the mountain and straight onto his waiting spears. It's a perfect plan. He simply has to clean up the retreating forces as they flee, disorganized and panicked. But dawn comes, and no sounds of battle are heard, when, through the fog, the sound of hoofbeats, and, to his horror, the entire enemy army charges into view, led by a samurai clad in the white garb of a warrior monk. The Fourth Battle of Kawanakajima has begun. I was really excited to see how the Yonezawa Festival was going to pull together this reenactment. I knew the city of Yonezawa was pretty small, so I lowered my expectations a little bit. But I was mostly just excited to see what they would do and how they would perform the exciting climax of the battle. So the battle itself takes place in 1561. The shogunate, or military government, has weakened while the daimyo, or samurai lords, have increased in power and are fighting for control and holdings for their clans. The samurai lord, Takeda Shingen, and the warrior monk, Uesugi Kenshin, are both very successful daimyo who have consolidated large swaths of Japan into their respective domains. A quick side note on names. So in a lot of East Asian countries, the family or clan name goes first and the given name goes second. Takeda Shingen, known as the Tiger of Kai, had started out as the oldest son of the daimyo of Kai, a poor, landlocked province with little arable land. At the young age of 15, Shingen assists his father's victory at the Battle of Unokuchi by executing a feint, or a fake retreat, and then catching the castle garrison by surprise. 5 years later, Shingen usurps his father to become the head of the Takeda clan. Warlords of the neighboring Shinano province marched onto the Kai province, hoping to capitalize on the young Shingen's inexperience. This coalition, made up of the Murakami, Ogasawara, and Suwa clans, greatly outnumbered Shingen's troops. However, they were defeated when Shingen launched a surprise attack in a rainstorm at night. So this is twice now that Shingen has achieved an unlikely victory through surprise, and we'll see that becoming a bit of a pattern. Shingen spends the next 11 years working his way northward through Shinano, completing his conquest in 1553 by seizing the last Murakami stronghold at Katsurao. This victory landed him now adjacent to the Uesugi territory of Echigo, and Uesugi Kenshin recognized Takeda Shingen as a worthy foe. Uesugi Kenshin, known as the Dragon of Echigo, was 9 years younger than Shingen and was born the third son of a warrior of the Nagao clan, not the Uesugi. In fact, his father gained renown by defeating the lords of the Uesugi, but died in combat. Kenshin was sent at 7 years old to a temple to study martial arts and Zen Buddhism. At 14, he was approached by retainers of his late father to contest the rule of the Nagao from his older brother. Multiple successful battles, and 5 years later, Kenshin is now the head of the Nagao clan and retainer of the Uesugi. The lord of the Uesugi comes to him, requesting refuge from the Hojo clan, and Kenshin agrees, for a price. He is to be named heir, lord of Echigo, but must bear that responsibility. So now, Uesugi Kenshin begins to consolidate the region. Now, we'll come back to Uesugi Kenshin later in the video because he's pretty fascinating for a lot of reasons. Not just for being the alleged victim of the most absurd ninja assassination ever. So I arrived in Yonezawa, and having checked my map on the train, began to wonder, wait, why is this festival in Yonezawa? We're pretty far from Kawanakajima. Well, first, Uesugi Kenshin had a famous castle in Yonezawa, and it also occurred to me that this was called the Uesugi Festival, and so everyone there was probably going to be pretty Team Uesugi. And second, stepping off the train and looking around, it kind of occurred to me that, like, obviously you couldn't actually have a reenactment like where the battle was, because obviously you're not going to have 33,000 people, and also it would probably take hours to like go all the way up the mountain and then down the mountain and across the river. So they were obviously going to have to condense it anyway. So why not in Yonezawa? But before the battle, there was a parade. The parade started with the Yonezawa Ancient Artillery Preservation Society. You can tell because that's what the banner says, except it's in cursive and mirrored because I sat on the wrong side of the street. The next few banners are what Uesugi Kenshin would have flown outside of his headquarters. The first banner is Bi, referring to the Buddhist deity of warfare, Bisha Mounten. I mentioned how Kenshin was sent to a temple in his youth, and he really took their teachings to heart, later believing himself a religious monk warrior who was the earthly avatar of this deity. The next banner is Ryu, or dragon, because Kenshin was Echigo no Ryu, or dragon of Echigo. The last banner, which you might be familiar with, is the Hinamaru sun disk. It is also present on the Japanese flag. Japan's sobriquet is Land of the Rising Sun. This specific dark blue flag is here because it was a gift from the emperor to Kenshin's father, and flying it was basically him showing off the emperor's approval. So the Ancient Artillery Preservation Society members walk past with their arquebus, in Japanese, Tanegashima. And if you're thinking, wait a second, samurai didn't have guns, you are not correct. The arquebus was introduced to Japan by the Portuguese in the 1540s and were a well-established element of warfare by the battle in 1561. The society produces and maintains their weapons using the historical methods, which is pretty cool. Next are the regiments of several of Kenshin's generals. Of note is the radish flag, the battle standard of Kakizaki Kageiie. Most warriors chose fierce animals, but Kageiie chose a radish. He was apparently an excellent general, but Kenshin later had him commit seppuku because Kageiie sold a very, very nice horse to the famous Oda Nobunaga. The horse was far too nice, so Kenshin suspected him of colluding with the Oda clan. The arms here include pikes, known as the Nagae-yari, asymmetrical bows called Higoyumi, and samurai with katanas. Even though samurai weren't the only ones to use katana, we know these are samurai because of their helmets, kabuto. Regular infantry would all be wearing the jingasa, shown on the arquebusiers. Next in the parade, the Uesugi taiko drum, also on the dark blue sun flag. The taiko drum was an important part of warfare because specific patterns were used to communicate orders. I was curious whether there were any battles where someone sent like a special detachment to secretly go mess with the taiko drum and maybe like destroy it or beat out the pattern for retreat, but it seems the taiko drums were generally housed in the field headquarters with the daimyo and like all the other valuable assets. So I guess if you manage to make it there, the continued operation of the drum is probably the least of your enemy's concerns. Then we have a few more historical generals, and finally, the daimyo himself, Uesugi Kenshin on horseback. His white headgear is a Soohei Zuken, the standard garment worn by Buddhist monks while traveling. The warrior monk and all that. Since he's on a horse, he is not carrying a katana, but a tachi, a sword with a longer blade to allow cavalry to strike down at infantry. Fun fact, but after the Sea of Yari became extremely effective at discouraging horse-mounted shock troops, many tachi blades were cut down to katana blades, as the length was no longer as useful. Then we have a squad carrying naginata. Naginata also contributed to the decline of the cavalry, as they were very effective at removing riders from their horses. Similar to tachi, once there were no longer horses, meaning they were no longer tactically relevant, they were cut down into wakizashi. The naginata was later in the Edo period viewed as a woman's weapon, wielded for self-defense and a show of status by women of nobility. In the Meiji period, the naginata was a popular martial art for women. Next, as the festival is also about general historical preservation, there is traditional dancing. The following float has nothing at all to do with the battles of Kawanakajima. It is a float celebrating local Yonezawa hero Maeda Keiji, who was like 8 years old during the battle. Keiji became a famous kabokimono, an archetype of the late Sengoku period, meaning a flamboyant outlaw. They were sometimes masterless samurai or ronin, and they liked to accessorize with bright women's clothing, patches of fur, velvet collars, large swords. They were lawless yet chivalrous, and were associated with loud singing, fighting in the street, homosexuality, and smoking. Their style became the prototype for kabuki theater. Anyways, Keiji is famous in Yonezawa for his choice to follow into exile his respected ally and friend, Naoe Kanetsugu, chief retainer of the Uesugi. The exile was to Yonezawa. His path is seen as an act of selfless loyalty. Also, Keiji was known for his immense height and his dear companion. His horse, Matsu Kaze, Wind in the Pines, was bred from only the finest horses and ran away to be free as the wind, until he met Keiji. Keiji's indomitable spirit found companionship with the horse, and they were never parted. Anyways, he has a float in the parade where he is historically accurately very large. Next, we have a section for the local Shinto shrine and associated youth group. In Japan, Shinto is an ancient folk religion with worshipping buildings called shrines, regardless of how large or small they are. Buddhism was introduced to Japan from India through China in the 6th century. Their buildings of worship are called temples. They also had a pony. Next, a Shinto priest wearing kanmuri on a white horse. In Shinto tradition, white horses are associated with the divine. The deity enshrined here is Uesugi Kenshin himself. In the Meiji period, Kenshin was formally deified. So the Shinto priests aren't just blessing the parade, they are carrying Kenshin's spirit through the streets to watch his own army march. And finally, concluding the parade are, I'm pretty sure, the Uesugi rear guard. I'm not totally sure which one is Amakase Kakamochi, but he is the general famous for being positioned at the river ford to hold off the massive Takeda woodpecker detachment. But we'll learn all about that in a moment. I really appreciated how these guys were working the crowd. They were great. So the parade is over, and you might reasonably be wondering, where are the Takeda? The Takeda await the Uesugi on the battlefield. But first, we had to walk there, and on the way, I got distracted. To really appreciate all the details in the reenactment, let's talk about the fourth battle of Kawanakajima. So at this point, both Kenshin and Shingen are powerful, but Shingen has been working his way north. And so in 1553, the lords of the Murakami and Ogasawara finally come to Kenshin, asking for him to put a stop to the advances of Takeda Shingen. Now, Japan is exceedingly mountainous, and the plain of Kawanakajima represented both the ideal staging grounds for Shingen to launch a full-scale invasion of Echigo, as well as a very important buffer for Kenshin to prevent such an invasion. Kawanakajima means island between two rivers, with the Sai to the north and the Chikuma to the southwest. Now, there are actually 5 battles of Kawanakajima, but not all of them are equally interesting. The first 3 battles involved minor skirmishes, with both commanders deciding to withdraw. First, because of winter. Second, because they both needed to deal with their respective domestic affairs. And third, because Shingen wanted to avoid a pitched battle. You see, a pitched battle is when both commanders kind of agree on a time and a place, and they both get fully prepared, and then they both just kind of fight. As we've seen from Shengen's previous successes, that's not really his style. The fourth battle of Kawanakajima is where the 2 powerful warlords finally meet in battle, and is the subject for the reenactment. Before the fourth battle, Kenshin is busy besieging a Hojo castle when he receives word that Shingen has mobilized 20,000 men and is headed towards the plain. Kenshin approaches with 13,000 men, intent on finally destroying this thorn in his flank for good. Kenshin takes up position at the mountain of Saijoyama, looking down on Shingen's Kaizu castle. But little does he know, Kaizu at this point only has 150 samurai, who were completely surprised by Kenshin's presence. Shingen arrives with his troops, and since both commanders know they will need the element of surprise for a decisive victory, Shingen enters his castle undisturbed. Shingen's army commissioner, Yamamoto Kansuke, comes up with the perfect plan of attack, Operation Woodpecker. During the night, the main Takeda force will sneak down onto the plain. Meanwhile, a commander will take an 8,000 men detachment and advance on Kenshin's camp. They will attack at dawn, surprising them and driving them fleeing down the mountain, across the river, and on to the waiting spears of Shingen's remaining force. It's called Woodpecker because I guess woodpeckers dislodge things that are high up. It's early dawn, and Shingen and his troops begin to prepare for the Uesugi fleeing down the mountain, when through the morning fog, they are attacked by Kenshin's vanguard. Kenshin guessed the surprise attack. We don't know if he had spies embedded in the Takeda clan, or if scouts brought warning. One source says that Kenshin knew because the night before, he saw too much cooking smoke coming from Kaizu Castle. It was too much smoke for just an evening meal, and suggested the preparation of marching rations. Regardless of how he knew, Kenshin had readied his forces, leaving only enough men to keep the camp's flames burning, and marched silently down the mountain, using bits of cloth to dampen the horses' hooves. The valley was thick with fog, so they were able to quietly cross the river, fully prepare for attack, and at dawn, start the charge into Shingen's unsuspecting troops. And attack they did. Shingen's troops were in the crane's wing formation, where the idea was that the opposing troops would contact the reinforced middle, and the wings would wrap around and flank them. However, this was not effective on Kenshin's winding wheel formation, where soldiers on the attack, when tired or wounded, were perpetually replaced by fresh units. The Takeda forces take heavy casualties from the winding wheel assault, commanders falling with each push, including Shingen's younger brother. The mastermind of the Woodpecker Plan, Yamamoto Kawansuke, seeing its abject failure, commits suicide by charging wildly into enemy ranks. And then the single most legendary moment occurs. The Uesugi vanguard breaches the Takeda center, and Uesugi Kenshin himself bursts into the command tent of Takeda Shingen on horseback. Shingen uses a war fan to successfully parry the attacks, long enough for one of his retainers to spear Kenshin's horse, causing it to flee. This is so epic. Daimyo did not engage in one-on-one combat. This is basically unheard of. Now, things seem to be going pretty well for Kenshin at this point. However, this is the moment when the woodpecker trap does kind of swing closed. The 8,000 men detachment has finally made it down the mountain and crossed the river to flank the Uesugi. At this point, the Uesugi begin to take heavy losses, and they retreat, ending the battle. Shingen does not pursue, and also retreats home, leaving the plain of Kawanakajima untaken. All told, the Uesugi army suffered 62% casualties, while the Takeda suffered 72. This is very unusual for the period, given the logistics of what combat actually looked like, but we'll come back to that. Uesugi Kenshin declares the battle a victory. Takeda Shingen also declares the battle a victory. Both just kinda go back home. There is a fifth battle of Kawanakajima, where Kenshin and Shingen meet again on the plain. They both sit there for 60 days, and then they both leave. I guess Shingen didn't see any opportunities for surprises. But what's cool is that Shingen and Kenshin both had profound mutual respect. At one point, the Hojo clan turned on the Takeda and blocked their supply of salt, which had the potential to cause a widespread famine. Kenshin famously sent salt from his own lands, saying, "I do not fight with salt, but with the sword." Indeed, when Shingen died, Kenshin famously wept, saying, "I have lost my good rival. We won't have a hero like that again." Anyways, the fourth battle of Kawanakajima is clearly pretty epic, and I was really excited to see the reenactment, especially the climax, where Kenshin bursts into Shingen's tent on horseback, and Shingen just parries him with a fan. It sounded like a pretty good time.
So I'm trying to decide where to sit because I really want to see, obviously, the fan pairing. And I'm assuming they're gonna have some staging and blocking, so in theory you can be at both sides of the river, but I really want to be wherever I'm gonna get the best view of that. So also, man, the other side of the river I'm a little confused by, because so there's the river and then there's a lot of brush. So I guess you might kind of be able to see it. I don't know. But yeah, I will try to figure out the best seat.
So there were a lot of snacks and reenactment swag that I managed to completely miss. Mostly because I got really excited and distracted by whatever this was. And I assumed they would still be there after the reenactment, but they had all packed up and left. And speaking of snacks, you might be wondering, what would the historical clans have been eating? Swords win battles, but a steady supply of calories wins wars, I assume someone has said. In any case, a major food during marching was hoshi, rice that had been cooked and then dehydrated so it was crunchy. It was portable and resistant to spoiling. It could be eaten dry while marching or cooked with water at the camp. Miso dama was miso paste with fish flakes and seaweed baked into a solid ball. After long marches or exertion, they would be tossed into your jingasa helmet with some water, a handful of hoshi, and held over the fire to make a soup rich in protein and electrolytes. There were also pickled plums, but the most interesting food was emergency secret edible rope. Yep, The ropes they brought to battle to tie on gear or use as belts were made out of taro stems, sometimes dried with miso. In urgent situations, they could cut off pieces and boil them to extract the calories and sodium. So I missed out on the reenactment snacks, but fortunately, I managed to buy one of the paid seats, and it came with a swag bag.
Done it yet? Let's see. This is... Oh. Okay, and then we have the switch. Okay, this might actually be the seat. Gotcha. Okay, cool. Okay, and then a water bottle. Luckily it's actually not super hot today. In fact, I'm a little worried about rain more than anything else. What is this? What is this? What? Oh, it's like a cooling pad. It's like themed.
So then, while other people were getting their snacks, I checked out the Great Climax fan pairing practice. It wasn't so much practice as it was attempts at horse desensitization. This horse was a very good horse, but it was no Matsukaze, and it was not thrilled with the heat of battle. There were several attempts with Kenshin on horseback. To my relief, Kenshin seemed to walk away uninjured. This poor horse was really not having it. He was doing a bit better later, but they made a rather wise prediction that the horse would not be in especially improved spirits during the actual reenactment, so this horse did not make a return performance. I'm really glad I got to see the practice though. The reenactment begins with the ceremony of the 3 cups, Sankan Nogi. These were departure ceremonies daimyo would perform before marching into combat. First up was Takeda Shingen. The stools they sit on are historically accurate because even though their armor was fairly light and surprisingly flexible, getting up and down from the ground wasn't incredibly dignified. Attendants bring the seated general 3 specific foods and accompanying sake that are eaten in a strict order. Uchi awabi, dried abalone, kachiguri, roasted chestnuts, and kombu, kelp. The order is important because it's a play on words. The first part of each of these words creates a homophone sentence. Uchi, kachi, yorokobu. Strike the enemy, win the battle, and rejoice. Once the general consumes the final kelp and drinks the sake, he stands, smashes the cup on the ground, raises his war fan, and leads the army in a battle cry. Side note, but I was not, in fact, familiar with the subtlety of these rituals while I was attending. I was able to learn a lot later from a famous historical document, Ganyo-oki. It's a record of military logistics written by Ise Sadatake in 1769. 200 years later. But it was also one of the best sources I could find on the weird but kind of banal stuff I was interested in. After the ritual, Takeda Shingen heads to his place on the battlefield, to the possibly YouTube copyright conflicting Flight to the Valkyries. And his troops follow. The reenactment stagehands, by the way, were dressed as ninja or shinobi, and I really appreciated that. Next, these 2 horsemen indicate, I think, that the Takeda army is mobilizing. An Uesugi scout comes to warn Kenshin of Shingen's movements. Kenshin then comes forward to perform his ceremony of the 3 cups. The arquebusiers begin their preparations for a ceremonial demonstration. Then, Shingen heads to his part of the battlefield with what also may be YouTube copyrighted music I did not recognize. Next, the Takeda Woodpecker Detachment is given their orders. And they head off towards the Uesugi. And I really enjoyed this. They actually go up the hill and cross the bridge. such that when their time comes, they actually cross the river to drive off the Uesugi. So I mentioned that a big part of the Uesugi managing to sneak down the mountain was the fog, and they recreated this by setting kindling alight to create billowing smoke. Here, the announcer says to pay attention to the fighting style of the Uesugi.
上杉軍は車がかりの戦法を持って攻撃に入りました。
And I think they're doing the winding wheel formation here, though I don't think this is meant to be an actual demonstration of how it would work, as much as like a cool visual. This next part was really cool. In order to give a good visual to the bow or higoyumi demonstration, they put smoke flares on the arrows, so you could see them fly through the air. Then it was time for some serious arquebusier fighting. I was really impressed by how difficult it must be to fire them standing. I can only imagine the kickback from these things must be almost dangerous. They sometimes had this kind of backward skip, I assume to try to dampen it. Both sides then line up and exchange fire. Speaking of fire, I noticed that maybe one of the smoke generating pits got a bit out of hand. Then it seemed like they were having trouble with a different smoke pit that now had open flame, but they did a great job handling it. Now the first charge and the chaos commences. Waves of troops would come forward and fight. And when, I think they were dead, they would leave the battlefield to make way for the next wave. This, I think, might be Yamamoto Kansuke's suicidal charge into the enemy ranks, maybe? But I couldn't quite see the banner. There are many such charges. You might be thinking, well, that's odd. Why are they wearing those little flags? They seem somewhat cumbersome, but I guess it's just so the audience can see what's going on in the reenactment? Well, no, actually. They did historically wear personal banners into combat. It was actually pretty important, because with the increasing use of the arquebus, battlefields would become choked with black smoke. Visibility was a major issue for commanders trying to figure out the state of the battle. Are the figures in smoke your guys, or the opponents? The banners were useful for signaling, but they were actually just one method of military communication in feudal Japan. So you might not have thought much about this, I hadn't, but it's actually pretty difficult to gather and leverage information without effective communication in this kind of combat. We can categorize communication into long-range visual signals, like banners, and audio signals, like the taiko drum. There were a few kinds of banners. The ones sticking up out of people's backs, which is still kind of wild to me, are called sashimono. These symbols I've been using to denote the different clans are called mon, and are similar to a Western coat of arms. These banners give me a similar discomfort to what I feel watching people play Quidditch. I personally don't really like the idea of running around outdoors while holding a long pole that can get stuck on things or stab me if I fall. There were also nobori banners, which denoted units. But the best banners are obviously the horo, which are basically just really cool capes. They were made to fill with air into a balloon while the samurai rode horseback, and according to this episode of Ancient Discoveries, they could block the strike of arrows.
Testing his archery skills, Mike is surprised to discover an unanticipated feature of a horo billowing in the breeze.
Look at it now, it's sort of dancing. The heraldry on the back is dancing about.
Samurai warrior 700 years ago, on horseback, being chased by a cavalry archer.
Horo could also identify the rider as a messenger, so that the troops would quickly part and let him pass. Other visual signals were the war fan, or gunbai. We saw Shengen using this in the reenactment to parry Kenshin. Gunbai were not traditional fans in that they do not fold. They were used by a commander as a directional pointer to indicate specific vectors of attack to officers. By raising, lowering, or pointing the gunbai in specific sequences, the commander could broadcast tactical shifts, like advance right flank. There were also sai-hai, or command batons, that were used for high visibility signaling of specific movements, such as the precise moment for an arquebus volley. It was in writing this out that I realized that the word volley in volleyball has like a meaning. So then there's also the audio signals. I mentioned the taiko drums before as a way to give commands and set marching pace, but conch shells were also used to signal, as they were able to carry acoustically over the gunfire, similar to trumpets. Now we are in the part of the battle where Kenshin charges into Shingen's camp. Kenshin comes riding in on what I am pretty sure is a different horse, unless they put like white splint boots on the previous one. I was unfortunately farther away this time, but it seems to have gone much better than the practice run. I attribute this to Kenshin not getting terribly close and not striking Shingen's war fan. It does make me wonder if the best war horses were entirely deaf and mostly blind, because I've never met a single horse that I think could handle like any of this. But let's talk about the war fan that Shingen uses to parry. In the reenactment, they use the signaling fan or the gunbai, but there were actually fans meant for parrying blows. Tetsun, or iron fans, were metal folding fans that could be used as weapons, and were particularly useful because they could be taken places where weapons weren't allowed. For example, Oda Nobunaga's court, when he invites you over just to chat, but secretly plans to assassinate you. They also might help with swimming. Anyways, there's another clash of troops, and right when things are looking hopeless for Shingen, his detachment crosses the river to come to his aid. They clash with the Uesugi, and during this fight, my two favorite characters in the whole reenactment make their appearance. This was what I was here for. Reenactors really giving it their all, clearly having practiced a lot. But now it was time for the last engagement, the final collision of the great clans. Bodies began to litter the battlefield, and this began to feel a bit like a shift in the tone of the reenactment. Like, their goal is to do historical preservation, make it engaging for modern audiences, and also acknowledge the loss of life. Up until this point, no one is even theatrically harmed. Units just kind of walk off together when it's their time. But in this final battle, as more and more bodies begin to cover the battlefield, you become reminded that over 24,000 people died, and while this is a lot of fun, there is a darker undercurrent. And then these guys come back.
No, 上杉の勝ちなり、辰野国より美濃国までは武田の勝ちなりと秀吉が封したこの激戦で戦死せる者武田方2800、上杉方3100と伝えられ、引き上げろ上杉は任せたい青いたい引け引け引きどら。
In theater, there's a concept called the magic circle, within which the rules of the performance apply. In the magic circle of this final engagement, the performers are dead. They stay down for a fairly long time, long enough that it is dramatic and potentially bordering on upsetting, particularly if you are one of the many young kids watching, and that's your brother or mom out there. So in order to break the magic circle and release the audience back into the real, Uesugi Kenshin, Yonezawa's hero, comes out to do a short speech. He thanks everyone involved, and then he engages the audience to help bring the soldiers back. But some warriors, even in resurrection, cannot forsake their fighting spirit.
No!
And that was the end. The performers came up with photos with kids, and me, and a lot of their kids joined them. I was really hungry at this point, and when I discovered that all of the snacks were gone, I went to Lawson's to get my favorite convenience store snack, a noodle sandwich. Or perhaps a sweet burger. Or maybe spaghetti and meatballs on a sandwich. Just kidding. I really go for the banana Baumkuchen. Overall, I loved it. This was a really complex story to tell, and I think they did a really great job. And I learned a lot. And I hope you did too, but we're not quite done yet. Because we're both really missing out on the 2025 Yonezawa Uesugi Festival, where Uesugi Kenshin was a woman, supported potentially by historical evidence? So the female Uesugi Kenshin theory was first put forth in the 1960s by Japanese novelist Tomeo Yagiri. He claims to discover a 16th century Spanish intelligence report on Japan in a Toledo monastery. It is a report from someone named Gonzalez to King Philip II, and it refers to Kenshin's nephew as having an aunt, Tia. The implication, of course, being that to the west, Uesugi Kenshin was a woman. So why would Kenshin not be a woman in Japanese historical documents? Surely the historical sources are accurate, and so I hate to break it to you because we've been having so much fun, but the Battle of Kawanakajima, and likely many of the legends from the Sengoku Jidai, are apocryphal. We don't actually have a ton of primary sources from that era because, you know, most of what we know about the Sengoku Jidai actually comes from the later Edo period. Now, you can kind of think about the Edo period as similar to the Renaissance. In Renaissance Europe, everyone got really excited about how cool the Greeks and Romans were and how awesome sculpture was, and I think it's a really interesting parallel. If you're ever in Rome, there's a really interesting museum called the Palazzo Altemps that has a section where each statue has a diagram showing which part of the statue is the original Roman and which parts were Renaissance additions. And it's kind of fascinating. In both the Edo period and the Renaissance, people were excited about the past and imitating its art, but also projecting modern sensibilities when filling in the gaps. A big reason that people in the Edo period created so much art about the Uesugi and Takeda clan exploits is that those clans had mostly diminished by then. So praising them was not a threat to the major Edo clans in power. Tales of bravery and chivalry were very popular in theater and art, and the Battle of Kawanakajima was often a subject. The numbers of troops present, the number who died, details like Kenshin noting the Takeda cooking fires, or the disgraced Yamamoto Kanzuke's suicidal charge into enemy ranks are apocryphal. Shingen parrying off Kenshin's Tachi strikes, also apocryphal. Even the woodpecker's strategy is first mentioned in an Edo period chronicle on military science that basically amounts to historical fiction. It was escapism for a samurai class that was now stuck doing a lot of bureaucratic paperwork. Even the less fantasized source I mentioned, the Ganyooki, was Edo period, written 200 years later. And that's not to say that we can't know anything about this era, but when we go to evaluate a claim, it can be hard to tell the difference between documentation and fabrication. So it takes effort, and that's fine. That's how history works. In this video, I wanted to talk about the reenactment from the perspective of how it is celebrated in Yonezawa. So instead of saying, according to dubious Edo source, like every other sentence, I added a red border to the screen every time I said something dubiously Edo in origin. Also, just to note, the Japanese Wikipedia page makes it pretty clear the mythos of the battle is based on a later Edo work. It's the English Wikipedia page that has the issues.
In the menstrual blood of virgins.
But we'll come back to that. So back to the female Uesugi Kenshin theory. Yagiri claims that his Spanish report shows that the West knew Uesugi Kenshin as a woman. His theory is that Kenshin underwent an Edo period rewriting of history to reflect the preferences of very masculine men. You can see this represented in the art. Older depictions of Kenshin show a softer, beardless figure, while Edo period representations are, you know, Yagiri puts forth more evidence. In the Edo period record of military exploits, the Koyo Gunken, Kenshin was noted as frequently suffering severe and debilitating abdominal cramps. Kenshin organized the Uesugi military campaigns around the 10th of each month. The cause of Kenshin's death, according to contemporary Matsudaira Tadaake, is daichu, which literally means great bug or parasite. but was a period euphemism for menstrual issues or uterine cancer. Then, Kenshin was a lifelong celibate and heavily leveraged adoption to secure lineage. When Kenshin visited the imperial palace in Kyoto, Yagiri claims he was given access to the women's quarters, which would basically be unheard of for a man. Kenshin had very feminine aesthetics and was interested in writing poetry, historical novels, calligraphy, and had garments that seemed tailored to a woman. This is actually an original garment belonging to Kenshin. And finally, there were contemporary female daimyo, such as Tachibana Genshio and Ie Naotora. And I read that and I thought, well, that seems plausible. Sort of. I mean, history is complex. There's often a lot of conflicting evidence. The thing is, though, that not all evidence is equally compelling. We can't know exactly what happened, but we can weigh different pieces of evidence to decide how likely different theories are. What's important is that we don't try to weigh evidence from our own internal preferences or bias. So let's go back through these claims. So, abdominal cramps indicating menstruation is unlikely. Kenshin was also contemporaneously noted as drinking a lot. Not to mention parasites being kind of a common problem. There was a general lack of thorough hygiene on long marches through the mountains. So I had a hard time figuring out the exact details around the 10th of the month logic, but even if that was true, menstruation generally isn't going to be exactly the same day every month indefinitely. And we know Kenshin followed various battle-related rituals, which would be much more likely to align with the 10th of the month. The cause of death being a feminine issue is also unlikely. So there's a lot of conflicting contemporary reports as to the cause of Kenshin's death. So let's put a pin in that. But from what I could find, Daiichu was sort of a catch-all for anything that could kill you from within. From stomach ulcers to stroke to feminine causes. But it doesn't seem to be a euphemism specifically for uterine cancer. The idea that Kenshin was celibate also seems unlikely. So Kenshin would eventually take vows to become a Buddhist monk, where celibacy is a requirement. Maybe that had been a goal of Kenshin's since the time in his youth at the temple. But interestingly, recently a ledger of deaths and memorials from Seijo-Oshin Temple lists in 1559 Echigo Fuchu Goshinzo. In Sengoku-era terminology, Fuchu referred to the domain capital and, by extension, the supreme domain lord Uesugi Kenshin. And Goshinzo unambiguously referred to the official wife of a high-ranking samurai. So it's possible that Kenshin wasn't actually celibate at all. Kenshin going into the women's quarters? No. This one was pretty confusing to research because I didn't find any official documentation to support the claim Kenshin entered the women's quarters. Kenshin visited the emperors in Kyoto in 1553 and 1559, and both times he was granted the privilege of shōden, which literally translates as ascending the hall. It granted an individual the legal right to bypass the outer courtyards and step up onto the wooden floors of the emperor's primary residential and working pavilion. I'm a bit confused, but it seems like maybe Yagiri is conflating the emperor's quarters with Kookyu, the inner harem or women's quarters, but they're not the same thing. It could be that there is non-official documentation or rumor that Yagiri is basing his claims off of, but the palace of the emperor was, if anywhere, where strict protocol was going to be followed. So this seems unlikely. Feminine aesthetics and interests? Absolutely no. This definitely seems to be an Edo, or modern take on what is feminine, incorrectly applied to the Sengoku era. Like, the interest in poetry I'm particularly confused by, because you know who wrote, a lot of poetry? Takeda Shingen. That was a thing samurai did, in addition to calligraphy. These only became feminine pursuits much later. Oh, and the garments tailored to a woman is actually not a kimono, which first appeared in the Edo period, but the preceding kosude, which, as you can see, is just a different cut. Still potentially man-sized, because it turns out that fashion evolves. Okay, this I did find pretty interesting. Tachibana Genshio and Ie Naotora were real women, and the ways they became daimyo are actually pretty interesting. Tachibana Genshio was the daughter of Tachibana Dosetsu, the daimyo of the Tachibana clan. He had no surviving sons, so while he could have named a distant relative, he saw a better solution to a succession crisis to be naming his daughter as his heir. He names her the lord of Tachibanayama Castle while he is fighting in the field, at the age of 6. Later, he adopts a son from an ally clan to marry his daughter. But what is interesting is that this adopted son does not immediately take over after marriage. He and his daughter co-rule. Her father dies shortly after, and she and her husband take on full responsibilities as daimyo of the Tachibana. Later, When they are not able to have children, her husband takes on a concubine, but instead of cohabitating, Genchiyo uses her status as the independent blood heiress of Doetsetsu to establish her own autonomous household court. She later mobilizes her retainers to successfully defend her estate, but eventually, as with most clans in the era, the Tachibana falls and she dies in exile. Genchiyo's ability to become a daimyo comes as her father's solution to prevent a succession crisis, but retainers all specifically come to Kenshin begging for help to take over control of the clan from Kenshin's weak brother. It doesn't seem likely that they would do this with a daughter. Ii Naotora is particularly interesting because she uses the Buddhist monk loophole. Naotora is the only daughter of the Ii clan and is betrothed to a cousin. That cousin's father, I guess her uncle, is forced to commit seppuku by the Ii's commanding clan, the Imagawa, and the cousin flees into exile. Naotora enters a Buddhist temple and, with her vows, takes the monastic name Jiro Hooshi. Jiro is a male name meaning second son, and Hooshi means Buddhist priest monk. In the samurai legal code, becoming a monk legally severs the individual from standard societal roles, granting them a quasi-neutral or legally male equivalent standing in certain contexts. So her cousin returns from exile, but she can no longer legally or spiritually marry him. So he marries someone else and takes over the Ii clan from her father, who has died in battle. Her cousin is accused of treason and is executed by the Imagawa. Her grandfather is poisoned, and at this point, all other male relatives have died in battle. So the only male Ii heir is her cousin's 2-year-old toddler, who is also marked for execution by the Imagawa. I do kind of have questions. Like, if the Ii were retainers of the Imagawa, why did the Imagawa clearly have it out for them? In any case, Naotora, now Jiro Hoshi, returns from the temple to become the de facto head of the clan, and begins using the male-coded military name Ie Naotora. She is at this point technically a monastic guardian, protecting the lands on behalf of the now hidden toddler heir. But documents from the era show her effective executive power, delaying executions, canceling debts. Later, the Imagawa instigate a coup, and she retreats to the temple for safety. 2 years later, the famous Tokugawa Ieyasu invades the province, crushing the Imagawa, and Naotora is reinstated as the head of the Ii. Once the former toddler, future famous Ii Naomasa, comes of age, she hands over the province back to him. Now, back to Kenshin. Kenshin did not take vows to become a Buddhist monk in youth at the temple, but towards the end of life. So the monastic gender bypass doesn't really line up time-wise. Also, while we're doing theories, there's a male Ii Naotora theory. But in contrast to the English wiki claim, the Japanese prevailing academic consensus still heavily favors the female Ii Naotora hypothesis. So let's move on. So looking back over these arguments, it doesn't seem super likely that Kenshin was a woman. What's also unfortunate is that the initial discovery that sparked the theory, Yagiri's discovery of the Spanish Ant document, seems to maybe almost certainly not be real, since no one has been able to convince Yagiri to actually share it. But just because Yagiri fabricated a piece of evidence, probably to sell his book, doesn't mean the theory is entirely meritless, just exceedingly unlikely. And there are other possibilities, such as Kenshin having been born intersex. Regardless, I think the female Kenshin theory is a nice additional apocryphal texture to the story, in the same way that, you know, a lot of the rest of it is apocryphal texture. And I think it's awesome that the Uesugi Festival cast a woman in the role in 2025, and I'm really sad that I missed it. If nothing else, I learned a lot trying to track down the merit of these claims. And speaking of interesting claims surrounding Kenshin, let's discuss his death. Okay, so it is speculated that Kenshin was the victim of one of the most wild ninja assassinations of all time. Kenshin goes to use the latrine, but when he sits down, he is violently stabbed from up the latrine by a ninja who had concealed himself down inside the latrine. The perfect crime. Nobody expects to be stabbed while using the latrine, especially from down within the latrine. And really, how else are you going to assassinate a powerful daimyo constantly surrounded by his retainers? He would never be without guards. Well, almost never. Now, it may not surprise you that there are also conflicting reports as to the cause of Kenshin's death. The most popular theory amongst scholars is the record of Kenshin Gunki, that on the 9th day of the 3rd month, he had a stomach ache in his toilet. This unfortunately persisted until the 13th day when he died. So maybe he did just die on the latrine, but without the ninja. In addition, he did know that he was going to die, because he wrote a death poem, or jinsei. Both heaven and hell are left behind. I stand in the moonlit dawn, free from clouds of attachment. Even a lifelong prosperity is but one cup of sake. A life of 49 years is passed in a dream. And he wouldn't have written a death poem anticipating a ninja attack from inside a latrine. Also, if the ninja is concealed within the cesspool of the latrine, how does he know which butt is Kenshin's? Maybe Kenshin was a woman. In any case, some people have decided, why not both? These theories aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe the ninja was able to identify him because he was spending a lot of time there. In any case, I have bad news for you about ninjas. Okay, so first of all, the term ninja itself is pretty modern. They were originally called shinobi. And shinobi did exist in the Sengoku period, but the way we imagine them as assassins is, sadly, you guessed it, an Edo fabrication. Actually, shinobi specialized not in martial arts, but in intelligence. They were known as listeners, or grass. The Bugensho, or very boring but probably very accurate payroll records, show both Shingen and Kenshin employed hundreds of shinobi at any given time. A shinobi was probably who warned Kenshin of Shingen's march to Kawanakajima, and also, assuming it happened, how Kenshin knew of Shingen's woodpecker trickery. Shinobi are documented as having engaged in espionage, mapping enemy terrain, analyzing logistics, and manipulating troop morale by spreading disinformation or organizing revolts. While they did engage in sabotage, like setting fire to supplies, assassination was considered poor strategy. Shinobi also included farmers who realistically had variable loyalty to their daimyo of the week, and were paid to pass on information both by their current lords and their aspiring future lords. It was writings centuries later that ascribed both the martial arts prowess as well as the retroactively applied proprietary techniques such as water escape. It was kabuki theater that gave us the visuals of men clad entirely in black with superhuman reflexes, really good at moving props. What's kind of funny is that in the West, we owe a lot of our incorrect understanding of ninja to British historian Stephen Turnbull. Japanese historians have been pretty clear this whole time that shinobi were paid informants and spies, in contrast to the myth of the ninja. But not a lot of their works or writings are in English. Since the 70s, Turnbull has been releasing books, journal articles, consulting on films such as 47 Ronin, even Shogun Total War, and this recent Netflix documentary.
He's become a considerably legendary figure in Korea. Supposedly his red coat was dyed in the menstrual blood of virgins.
Turnbull is frustratingly the most common source I saw cited on the Kawanakajima related articles on Wikipedia. Turnbull, in turn, cites the Edo period accounts, not the primary sources. And his works are largely why we think of ninja as a cult of assassins. However, to his credit, in 2014, Turnbull published a journal retraction, and in 2017, Turnbull releases another book, Ninja, Unmasking the Myth. So this is an editing note, but is that the papyrus font? In this book, he acknowledges that the historical ninja, as a distinct, specialized class of black-clad assassins, did not, in fact, exist. He systematically dismantles the very myths he had helped popularize, noting how, regrettably, the Edo period propaganda had duped historians, himself included. I have had problems in the past with cats coming into my garden and making a mess, but last Christmas I was provided with a possible solution. It was a gift of a plastic garden gnome in the shape of a ninja. And you know what? I appreciate the intellectual honesty, but also please do not cite any of his works prior to 2014. Another editing note. Okay, just don't cite this guy at all. At least based on this 2021 Netflix documentary. So he's basically correct here, referring to the Iko Iki.
We must put from our minds any image of these Buddhist monks being peaceful men who spent their lives in prayer. They were a formidable military enemy.
But then later he says this about ninja.
But in addition to the normal martial arts, these would also include the techniques of preparing explosives and even, in some cases, poison.
Like, no, Dr. Turnbull. This is a 2021 documentary, 7 years after your retraction, where it seems you are still referring to an Edo period 1676 manual about ninjas training in explosives. Bansen Shukai is an Edo source. You said it was regrettable about how historians were duped, but you're duping again. The usual approach, even among scholars, is to simply accept the original ninja myth as a genuine historical phenomenon that has, for centuries, been greatly romanticized and, more recently, highly commercialized. This modern exploitation of the ninja has proved highly profitable. Doing research for this video was pretty challenging because I was doing my best to find primary sources, but I'm obviously not able to interpret them in context. So some of my best sources were Japanese museum websites. They do a great job categorizing and explaining documents and artifacts, but even then there's still a pretty massive translation barrier. But as with all my videos, be sure to check the pinned comment for any errors that I've made. Bonus fact. I was extremely indulgent in this video and basically packed in all the cool facts, but I did save some. The city of Yonezawa has a mascot named Kaneten, who is a samurai dog with the kanji for love on his helmet. I also walked past some construction that had this sign showing one construction worker snitching on, I guess, another shifty and sweating construction worker who is either screaming with crooked teeth or has a coffee bean for a mouth. Also, this is probably a coincidence, but Yonezawa was the first place I saw McDonald's green melon flavored Fanta McFloat for sale, and I resisted the temptation at the time, but now I heavily regret it. Bonus editing fact. I was watching the 1969 film Samurai Banners that covers the Battle of Kawanakajima, and there's this one part where they have multiple people wielding this giant floppy blade. I had a lot of questions, but I managed to track it down to a single weapon forged in 1446 called the Norimitsu Odachi. It was not actually used for combat. It was just a massive flex by the Osafune Swordsmithing Guild. Giant swords were commissioned at the time for use as decorations or in shrines, but they were not combat ready because obviously they were not meant to be wielded. So they had tiny tangs, so as not to waste metal, but more importantly, they were not quenched because heating and cooling a massive amount of steel uniformly without cracking is thermodynamically exceptionally difficult. The reason the Norimitsu Udachi was such a swordsmithing flex is that it was combat ready, fully quenched with a correctly proportionally sized tang. It was commissioned by a 21-year-old Bichu samurai, so do with that information what you will. In the film, I guess they just thought it looked really cool. Bonus fact from my Patreon member. Luís Frois was a Portuguese Catholic missionary who worked in Japan during the Sengoku period, who actually met both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He wrote a manuscript in 1585 comparing Japanese and European life and customs. There are 611 extremely European-coded distichs comparing them, including, we sniff our melons at the top, the Japanese sniff them at the base, and we cut our melons lengthwise, the Japanese cut them crosswise. Europeans train for swordplay on posts or animals, Japanese use dead human bodies. No, this was actually the Japanese testing blades on convicted and executed criminals. They weren't actually used for training. At all times, we spit away from ourselves. The Japanese usually swallow their spittle. Among us, men enter the religious life to do penance and to save their souls. Buddhist monks enter the religious life to lead a life of pleasure and idleness, and to avoid work. Europeans kill wild boars with spears, guns, and hounds. The Japanese often beat the woods to drive them out, so that they can kill them with swords. We are terrified to kill a man, but think nothing of killing cows, chickens, and dogs. The Japanese are terrified to see animals killed, but killing men is commonplace. This is probably referencing the Buddhist influence against killing animals, contrasted with the normalization of human violence in the Sengoku era. However, it's not like Europeans didn't have their share of violence. Among us, sneezing is a natural occurrence and no heed is paid to it. In the Goto Islands, it is regarded as an ill omen, and anyone who has sneezed on a given day may not speak to the local tono. And my favorite one, in the homes of European nobility, guests are first welcomed into the living quarters. In Japan, their first reception takes place in the stables. They really wanted to show off their very, very nice horses. The longer the mane on our horses, the prettier they are. The Japanese cut the whole thing and at intervals attach pieces of wheat straw, which they think makes them look very elegant. These are translations from a 2014 book called The First European Description of Japan.